When we talked about the Jerusalem church, we devoted a lot of time to James and the mysterious and interesting figure that he is. Told some, stories that maybe a lot of people aren't familiar with. Shared some laughs. We did the same thing with Peter. Obviously, a very important tradition of the early church and the later church. I think we need to do the same thing with John, which is why I think this is a necessary stop in our journey.
Yeah, coming out of it. Well, it's also because John takes us into the 2nd century, and John's kind of that final apostolic word. You have all these great apostolic traditions. Well, John is that final apostolic word.
Yeah,
and it's appropriate to get to him now.
And we made promises to our audience members that
we would get out of the 1st century.
Oh man, yeah. So let's start with just like maybe the baseline, right? If you're a Roman Catholic, grew up Catholic, going to Mass, just kind of what you might already know about John at the baseline.
Yeah, I think the most famous painting of John is Da Vinci's Last Supper, where John's pictured right next to Jesus. In the Gospel, it says that John was the one who was leaning on Jesus' breast at the Last Supper. John is often portrayed as someone who's very young, so longer flowing hair, no beard at all. And we get the sense that he was kind of a young, passionate, kind of emotive person in the Gospels. We'll also see that he's portrayed with or portrayed as an eagle.
Yeah, yeah, and that's mainly just because he's sort of the all-seeing theologian, right?
Yeah, so tradition also names him St John the Theologian, and it's because his gospel kind of soars above the rest in its depth and its theology.
Yeah, and to that point, so the writings that we get from him that we all may be familiar with is the Gospel of John, especially, probably the most familiar. The Book of Revelation would be the close second, of course. But then we also do get 3 small letters from this John or the Johannine tradition.
Yeah, 3 small but very profound, actually, little letters. So that makes 5 books of the New Testament out of the 27 belong to John in this Johannine tradition.
Yeah, and when we were talking about the Jerusalem church and the Jerusalem council, Paul, we mentioned that John was considered a pillar. Right?
So in St. Paul's letter to the Galatians, he names Peter, James, the Lord's brother, and John as the pillars of the church, reputed to be pillars of the church. And you definitely see that in the early chapters of Acts. The first pillars of the church were Peter, James, son of Zebedee, and John, son of Zebedee. So the 2 brothers were part of the pillars, and then James is martyred in year 42. And you see that's when the Lord's brother, we said, steps into this leadership position in Jerusalem. But so John is there since the beginning as a pillar of the church.
Yeah, yeah. So it makes sense that we would have to devote some time to him. I think so that's a good baseline knowledge. So it's more interesting and mysterious and textured than that.
Yeah,
and I think that's what we really want
there's
to
so
do
many
here.
great traditions about John, even just deriving from the 2nd century after he passed away. But you always still feel there's this mystery that's still there about him, even though we have a lot more on him than perhaps other apostles. You still feel like I can't quite get him. I can't quite grasp.
There's still a lot of question marks even after you study him, and a lot of unknowns. So if we can get everybody totally confused, that we would have done our job.
We've done our job. Yeah, exactly.
So we start off with John's story. What is John's story? Where is he from? So he comes from a little town just around the area of Bethsaida. His father is Zebedee, is his name. His mother is Salome. And where we learn that actually is if you look in the crucifixion narratives of Mark's Gospel and Matthew's Gospel. If you do a comparison work there, you'll see that in Mark's Gospel, Salome is mentioned. Yeah. In Matthew's Gospel, Salome is not mentioned, but what you do get is, that we have Mary Magdalene is there, Mary, the mother of James and Joseph, and then it says, and the mother of the sons of Zebedee. So that's how, boom, you make the connection. Okay, so it's Salome. So they own a pretty a thriving fishing operation.
Yeah, it seems so from the Gospel of John itself. So Zebedee, their father, owns the fishing business. He has hired hands, which tells you that it's more than just a little family business. They have servants and hired hands that are working this this fishing business, and that's important because what that allows us to imply is that John and his brother James, his older brother James, have leisure. Yeah. They have time to go and do other things.
Yeah. Yeah, to go follow preachers and prophets if they want to. But, and to the Salome point, to put a little more flesh on that, Salome kind of makes us think that he has a connection to the temple, right?
He does. So yeah, mentioning Salome is significant because we can also connect Salome with Elizabeth, John the Baptist's mother.
Follow the family line here,
Yeah.
guys.
So there's some kind of relation that's going on between Salome and Elizabeth, which means that John himself is perhaps of a priestly lineage, priestly families, and that's significant because we also hear it in his own gospel that it was John alone who knew the high priest at the time. So it seems pretty likely that John is of a priestly lineage. But he has time to maybe go back and forth from Jerusalem back home to work in the fishing village, back to Jerusalem to serve as a priest maybe. But he also has time to follow somebody, and that is John the Baptist himself.
Right. So because of the hired hands, the leisure, he might have the time with his brother to be following around with John the Baptist, who might also very well be a relative of theirs.
Well, exactly, and it's actually implied in his gospel. So in John's gospel, John likes to leave himself out of it by not naming himself. He'll always refer to a disciple, or to the disciple whom Jesus loved, or the disciple on Jesus' breast. It's all referring back to him. He just doesn't put his name. So we hear in the Gospel, chapter 1, verses 35 to 42, that John the Baptist is preaching, and there's two followers who are following him. John goes on to name one of the followers, but he doesn't name the other one. So it's kind of in line. So Andrew was the other one, and then there's John. That's interesting because it's probably himself who he's speaking of, right? This other unnamed disciple. So John the Apostle was most likely a follower of John the Baptist. It's also interesting that he names Andrew as his kind of buddy, who is also following John the Baptist. Remember, Andrew is also a fisherman, the brother of St. Peter.
And this whole area of Bethsaida, this is where Peter, Andrew, James, and John, both of their families are running a thriving fishing business. So they would have known each other.
Yeah, they definitely would have known each other.
It's significant, I think, at this point to hone in on the fact that he's young. I think it's important because from a very early age, he's drinking in, we can say, Essene Jewish theology through John the Baptist, which then later he will color by following Jesus, kind of fill it in. And so if you really wanted to just go and read John eventually, like we'll talk about in the next episode, having those two, in your mind, those two influences kind of opens up the gospel for you and opens up his thought. But it's important to note that that's what he's being formed by at this early phase. And of course, being young, we get hints that he's a little rambunctious.
Yeah,
right?
well, he's passionate, he's motive. There's an episode in Luke chapter 9 where he's upset that people aren't following Jesus.
You said an episode, like on Netflix, or something.
In this episode, John says, asks Jesus, "Hey, can we call down fire from heaven on them because they didn't listen to the gospel?" And it says that Jesus turned to him and rebuked him right away. So John is kind of almost has this zealous character, perhaps getting it from John the Baptist.
Yeah.
John the Baptist himself is a very zealous character.
Yeah.
So he carries over that kind of emotion and passion in his own ministry, and then Jesus rebukes him at it.
Yeah, and then even in another episode is when they ask what if they can sit at his right or his left. Jesus is right and his left when he comes in his kingdom.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And
then Jesus says, like, "Can you drink the cup that I'm going to drink?" So it shows that they're a little bit assertive. They're passionate. And so then Jesus gives them the name Sons of Thunder. Right?
Sons of Thunder for that reason. Yeah.
So the other thing is that John is, for his formation purposes, he's there for all the major events of Jesus's ministry, before and after even. I mean, he's there. If you really draw it out, he's there following John the Baptist as one of the inner circle. Like, John is part of this inner circle of John the Baptist's followers.
Yep.
From there, he goes and follows Jesus. He's there for the transfiguration. He's there for the trial. He's there
at the
for
crucifixion.
He's there for the Last Supper. He's there for
yep.
the crucifixion.
All the major events in Jesus' ministry, John is present at.
He's the first one to enter the tomb at the resurrection.
To get to the tomb, yeah.
He's there even at like Pentecost, Jerusalem Council. He's there, man. For all of it.
And I think the point of us bringing all that out is to say there's this narrative among History Channel theologians that the early apostles were poor, they weren't great thinkers and all that. But if you look at somebody like John, who had leisure, who studied, think about him as studying the law, perhaps, because his father has some money. Maybe he studied the law in the synagogue. He was a follower of John the Baptist. He listened to the great prophet all the time. Then he's a follower of Jesus. At a young age, he's being shaped and formed with all these theological influences.
Yeah.
And no wonder he's the eagle. No wonder he's John the theologian who soars above the rest.
Yeah. So I mean, it makes perfect sense then that he would emerge as a pillar of that early Jerusalem church, as Paul points out. So the last time that we see him, though, so if we look at the first history book of the church, which is the book of Acts in the Bible, John disappears in the narrative after Acts chapter 8.
In Acts chapter 8, he goes up to Samaria with Peter to preach the gospel. And then he kind of just is gone. We don't hear from him again. And the story begins to focus more on Peter and then certainly more on Paul's missionary journeys.
Okay, and so we'll pause there. So John in Samaria in the book of Acts, last time that we hear about him. Now, at this point, for those of you who remember R.L. Stein's Goosebumps, Choose Your Own Adventure, you get to choose your own adventure. So either John dies early at some point here after the Acts chapter 8, martyrdom, what have you. Or, option 2, he lives to old age and eventually gets to Asia Minor.
Yeah, so speaking to that, the first tradition that he maybe dies younger, you go back to that verse in Mark and in Matthew where they're asking Jesus, can I be at your right, can I be at your left in the kingdom? And Jesus says to them, well, can you basically drink the cup that I'm going to drink, referring to his death? So basically, can you be killed and martyred the way I'm going to be killed and martyred? And of course, their answer is, yes, of course we can.
Yeah.
The passionate Zebedee brothers. Of course we can. And Jesus says, well, certainly you will. You will drink the cup that I'm going to drink.
Yeah.
So the implication there is that they're both going to die. So you have this kind of early tradition, even in the Gospels itself, the Synoptic Gospels, that perhaps John died early.
Yeah. So in John's Gospel, however, at the end, there's maybe a little pushback against that because you see that Jesus implies that John is going to live longer than Peter.
Yeah, well, but also that Acts doesn't record John's martyrdom is suspicious because it does record his older brother's martyrdom.
That's a good point.
So James the elder dies in 42, is killed, martyred. And so to not name also John's martyrdom would be a little odd.
Yeah.
So, okay, he disappears in Acts chapter 8, but perhaps he goes somewhere. He goes to Ephesus. So I think we're gonna show that the evidence is stronger for the second tradition that John lives on.
Yeah, because the proponents of the tradition that John dies early, what they do, and this goes as far back as Eusebius, the early church historian of the 4th century. He zeroes in on a fragment of another father. Stay with me, in the early 2nd century, whose name was Papias.
Yeah, Bishop of Hierapolis.
So he's the Bishop of Hierapolis in Asia Minor. Now, in Papias' own writings, so in a fragment that we have, he's talking about how it was his custom to go whenever he would meet somebody who knew the apostles or the elders or the people who followed the apostles. He would ask them, what did he say? What did he say? And he would write it down. And in fact, Papias had like 5 books that are lost.
Yeah.
But he says, now, if by chance someone who had been a follower of the elders would come my way, I inquired about the words of the elders. Now listen, he says, what Andrew or Peter said, or Philip, or Thomas, or James, or John, or Matthew, or any other of the Lord's disciples. Now listen to this. And whatever Aristion, or the elder John, and the Lord's disciples were saying. See, and so Eusebius zeroes in on that. And he says, see, there's an elder John. And that's distinct from John Zebedee. So the people who would say that John Zebedee, this tradition, the Matthean and the Markian tradition, that he dies early, they would say this elder John is really that older John who's writing the Gospels.
Who takes over the Johannine tradition, exactly, and writes all 5 of those documents we've already mentioned,
But the tradition is too strong, right?
It's too strong in the 2nd century.
That Zebedee makes it to Asia Minor. Because if you look at the connection of another saint, St. Polycarp, who's the bishop of Smyrna in the 2nd century. Irenaeus, knows of Polycarp very well, and he says that Polycarp he knew John out here, So he's a companion of John in Asia Minor. That places him at least there. But then you come to St. Justin Martyr in the mid-2nd century, who in one of his writings, The Dialogue with Trypho, he's talking about Ephesus, and he says that John was with us in Ephesus. So there's another attest to it. The other thing is that you have Cerinthus. He's an arch heretic of the early 2nd century. We get stories about...
He's active in Asia Minor.
Yeah, he's active in Asia Minor, and he was one of John Zebedee's biggest opponents. So again, placing John in this area.
Yeah, and then you also get, maybe most importantly, Polycrates, the bishop of Ephesus. Polycrates is an interesting figure. We have a fragment of one of his letters that he wrote to Pope Victor, in the late 2nd century. And he says, "Before me were 7 of my relatives who were bishop of Ephesus. I am the 8th. And I know that John the Apostle is buried here in Ephesus."
Yeah.
So that's a pretty big witness. Down the generations passed from family members. In the year 196 or so, he's writing this letter to Pope Victor.
Now the church universally recognizes this at this point. I mean, even in the early days, they recognize that John is buried in Ephesus. You have
well. Let me say, you do hear of it even from heretics. So we have a second century document called the Acts of John, and the Acts of John basically tell the history of John from a heretic's point of view, the Docetist heresy. But they're speaking of the Acts of John, and they place John also in Ephesus and his death in Ephesus as well. So you're not just getting it from great church figures, you're also getting it even from people who are against the church.
And just to dissuade people from maybe thinking at this point that, well, yeah, it's still John the Elder, though. Where's the Zebedee connection? The Zebedee connection comes in with the Marian tradition, right? Because Mary's doma was there.
Yeah, so you can go to the shrine today near Ephesus, and the house of Mary is there where she stayed. Remember, Mary is given over to John. Jesus does it at the cross, and the tradition is that John took Mary with him to Ephesus, and where Mary stayed is there, right? So you get both Christians and Muslims who visit this shrine in Ephesus. That's strong there. It brings up the question though, why Ephesus? And there's this Mary connection to Ephesus. We said that John, son of Zebedee, is the follower of John the Baptist, or was the follower of John the Baptist.
Yeah.
John the Baptist, of course, is related to Jesus, related to Mary. Elizabeth and Mary are cousins.
These are all distant family members.
These are all family members. It's interesting in the book of Acts, chapter 18 and 19, you see that there are all kinds of John the Baptist's followers living in Ephesus who have not yet received the full gospel.
Yeah.
And so they have the gospel being preached to them. So we know that Ephesus, for some reason, is a hub of John the Baptist kind of people, which, we can only guess, but it makes sense that perhaps there's family members of John the Baptist there, which means that it's family members of Mary herself.
And which makes sense if you remember what's going on back in Judea. You've got the Jews and the Romans going at it, and Jerusalem has been destroyed. So eventually it becomes a dangerous place to be in Jerusalem. So people are finding their family in distant lands in the diaspora to go live. So again, it would lend credence to the idea that John and Mary would settle in a place for a while, at least, to settle in Ephesus, where they have kin, potentially, but also fellow travelers, right, of John the Baptist. Now, these would be John the Baptist. So John Zebedee was a very close, he's part of the inner circle, I think we had mentioned, and the people out here in Ephesus didn't hear about like the Holy Spirit or any of these kinds of things. That's what it says in Acts. Like, we didn't know there was a Holy Spirit that we had to be baptized into. We just know of John the Baptist, So this is sort of the loose followers of John the Baptist. So it's ripe. It's a ripe place for John to do some ministry. And so that lends credence to the Ephesus thesis.
Well, it's also a safe place for Christians because when Paul writes his letter to the Ephesians, you don't get the sense that there's great persecution going on. You don't get the sense that there's sectarianism happening within the city of Ephesus. And in the book of Acts, when it says that Paul is leaving Ephesus, they're crying and wanting him to stay. It's safe here. It seems like there's a united front in the city of Ephesus. All the elders, it says, were gathered around Paul and crying and weeping and seeing him off as he went back to Jerusalem. So it just seems like Ephesus is a good place to be if you're a Christian. There's also a thriving synagogue there, of course. So the ongoing debate between Jesus believers and non-Jesus believers among the Jews.
Yeah. So then I think where we would land, and this is just our opinion, feel free to disagree, is that to solve this issue of did John die early or did he go to Ephesus, we would just say there are two Johns. According to Papias, there are two Johns. There's John Zebedee, John the Elder. What connects them is this relationship of discipleship, most likely. That John the Elder is a disciple of John Zebedee in much the same way that Mark becomes kind of Peter's interpreter, John Mark. So what we would postulate is most likely what's going on here is that the Gospel of John is written by the physical hand of John Elder, but he's relaying, obviously, John Zebedee's preaching.
And the Gospel itself tells you that.
Yeah.
tells you that the
disciple who told us
these things is true. So you get the sense that there was somebody compiling the gospel, at least. That could be John the Elder. You have scholars who mark out differences in terminology between the three letters and then the gospel itself, and then the terminology of revelation in the gospel itself. So it's very likely that John the Elder carries on the Johannine tradition in writing the letters, because of course he refers to himself in the letters as John the Elder, John Elder, John the Presbyter. And then, of course, Revelation, there's some differences in terminology that are different from the letters. So what we're getting at is John the Apostle is certainly the witness of the gospel, relays it to John the Elder. John the Elder is perhaps the writer of the letters, but I think we would say that Revelation, maybe most parts of Revelation, are actually the apostle who wrote it as well.
Yeah, yeah. And there's a lot of indications when I read it too. It's like there's a lot of indications of that background again, of an Essene theology as brought to John Zebedee by John the Baptist, because you get even the vision of the 144,000 where he says that they're all dressed in white and they have the seal upon their foreheads. Well, Essenes dressed in white when they worshiped. You have that whole narrative of where the woman is chased out into the wilderness by Satan, which is referred to as like Israel.
Yeah,
but
it's
the question is
of what happened with the Cumites.
Yeah, the question is, when did that happen? It's not back in the 40 years in the wilderness with Moses. It's most likely the Essenes when they had gone out into the wilderness. So it's there are echoes of that in there. You can draw it out.
Well, there's also this terminology, this dualism that's there in John, certainly. And it's actually great because a lot of scholars, before we found the Dead Sea Scrolls, and we associate those with the Essenes, before we found the Dead Sea Scrolls, a lot of scholars would look at the Gospel of John, the letters of John, Revelation of John, and say, this couldn't have been written by a Palestinian. Right. And so they dated it later to outside somewhere else. But now that we know that a lot of that Essene terminology and ideology is also found in John, well, now we can say it comes from a Palestinian. It comes from somebody like John. Yeah, which lends credence to the idea that the apostle did in fact write these documents.
Yeah, and there's a lot of other arguments that we could put forward, bolstering this thesis. But I think we'll settle there that we believe that it is John Zebedee who writes Revelation, and it's likely John Elder who authors the gospel and
compiles the gospel. Yeah, and perhaps authors the letters.
Yeah, yeah.
But it's all. But again, this isn't something against tradition.
Right.
This is all the Johannine tradition, and it's like Dr. David Ahn says about prophets, right? John's a prophet, and he most likely had a school of people around him, a school of prophets, writing to the churches in Revelation. And John is one of his prophetic disciples who's carrying on his teaching, John's teaching.
And it's from Ephesus. So now, we place John Zebedee in Ephesus. It's from Ephesus that he now spends the rest of his life battling, doing a lot of battle with false prophets. You see the Nicolaitans in the book of Revelation. You see these followers of who he dubs the Jezebel, the prophetess Jezebel. So there's some kind of a prophetess running around over there. You get the Cerinthians, the followers of Cerinthus. You have Docetus, all these groups. And John is doing battle in Ephesus. There is a point, though, where John is exiled, right? He gets caught up in a persecution, and he's on the island of Patmos, which is where he then drafts his Revelation. And this point that you're bringing up about David Ahn, it always fascinated me. David Ahn doesn't go too far into it. He postulates it, and he says, might that be what these angels are in the churches in Revelation, where he's writing back and says, to the angel of the church of Philadelphia, to the angel. Those are resident prophets in resident communities, and John is the master prophet. And this is why even later tradition calls him John the seer. It's interesting because the seer, that's a very ancient way of describing a prophet. That's going back to the shamanistic period of Israel's history. They were called seers.
Yep, exactly.
So it's just so interesting, that he might have had this whole prophetic
guild
in Asia Minor. Now, after his time in Ephesus, persecution, his exile, in Patmos, he comes back
to
Ephesus, lives out the rest of his days, presumably.
Yeah, we get some fantastical stories and some anachronism in the Acts of John, which is how you know it's from the 2nd century, the anachronisms that are in it. And a lot of miracle stories and different things that John was doing there. But there's a moving ending to the whole episode. in John in Ephesus, and that is that he gathers his disciples together. He's older, he knows he's going to die, and he shares a Eucharist with them. It's this great little scene. And then he calls some disciples over and he says, dig a trench. And they start digging a trench. They're not sure what it's for. But then he strips his linens off, puts the linens in the trench, and gets into it. And now this is going to be his grave, basically. So he gives them a final blessing, says, peace be with you. And then it says he went to sleep. And so he was buried there in Ephesus. Now, what's interesting is the Greek manuscripts of the Acts of John say that he was translated actually into heaven. He was assumed into heaven. So there's this assumption tradition that's there in the early traditions about John. But that, again, the Acts of John, it's later. The Acts of John, again, is a heretical document in the Apocrypha, New Testament Apocrypha, but also confirms that John was there and then how
he's living out his final days in Ephesus. Like, even his enemies know where he is, in other words. So John... What's great about him being this bridge character is that these very groups that I mentioned to you, the Cerinthians, the Docetics, these are the same heresies that the early 2nd century fathers are going to still be dealing with after John's death. So that's why John is sort of this bridge character, because he becomes sort of the first apostle to have to deal with strange ideas emerging from
He's
the
kind
Christian
of the
community.
arch-apologist, the first arch-apologist for Christianity, encountering these strange ideas, and he gives us his eyewitness testimony.
Yeah, and this is what we'll see in this 500-year history narrative that we're drawing out, is that the church usually lives with a certain amount of plurality until it hears something that's foreign to the rule of faith that it received, and it says no. But see, no is not enough. When the church says no to something, it then has to say, yeah, but what then?
Yes.
And then that's how the church now defines its doctrine. Well, that's what John is. John is the first loud and resounding no to certain things. And that's contra, again, History Channel history, like the Crossons of the world, who are like, they just celebrate the diversity in the earliest, church with the Gnostics. The Gnostics were actually great Christians and this kind of stuff. No. John is that figure that you zero in and say, but what about John? Because John is the one who says no. And when we looked at James, Peter, I loved like some of the stories that you brought up about James, especially through Hegesippus. I want to do the same thing with John, because it's like every Catholic boy's dream, to almost be like, what was it like really to be around the man, to be with him? We have maybe more cute stories about like the James and the Peters of the world, but John has some too that I think are worth relating. So I think the first one is like the Cerinthus bathhouse narrative. Yeah,
so you get this story preserved in Eusebius, the 4th century church historian, and he's quoting Irenaeus, and Irenaeus says, I myself saw Polycarp of Smyrna in his early years, for he lived a long time and was very old indeed when he laid down his life by a glorious and most splendid martyrdom. He then says, and there are people who heard Polycarp describe how John, the Lord's disciple, when at Ephesus, went to take a bath, but seeing Cerinthus inside, rushed out of the building without taking a bath, crying, let us get out of here, for fear the place falls in, now that Cerinthus, the enemy of truth, is inside.
I love that story. I love the story because it shows the two aspects of John's personality that we just said, that he's the first no to heretics in calling someone like Cerinthus the enemy of truth. So he's clearly defining the truth line. But then further, he says something queer where he says, for fear that this place will cave in, that in other words, that God will strike it down because he's in here. That shows a very prophetic side of John. Yeah. So it's almost like that's John. That's
it's believable too, right? Because he was the one who wanted to call down a fire from heaven.
Exactly.
So very prophetic, and saying this place might cave in on us if we're here with Cerinthus, so we better get out of there.
So I love it. It's just like this little window into his personality, and I just love thinking of even just being the little disciple going with John to the bathhouse. Like, that's just such a cool story. But then there's another one too, right? About how John, in his later days, wore the mitre?
Wore priestly garments. So, again, Bishop Polycrates, he says, in Asia, great luminaries sleep. He's writing to Pope Victor, who shall rise again on the last day, the day of the Lord's advent, when he is coming with glory from heaven and shall search out all of the saints, such as Philip, one of the 12 apostles, who sleeps in Hierapolis with his 2 daughters, who remained unmarried to the end of their days, while his other daughter lived in the Holy Spirit and rests in Ephesus. Again, there is John, who leant back on the Lord's breast, and who became a priest, wearing the mitre, a martyr and a teacher. He too sleeps in Ephesus.
So that's interesting too. That shows you there's another tradition of maybe he was martyred in Ephesus as an old man, but it also brings up this really weird thing about him wearing the turban or the mitre.
Yeah. So the language
high
there
priest.
is the sacerdotal plate, which actually refers to the turban, the head turban of the high priest for the Jews. And Polycrates is telling us that John, in his old age, wore this this turban on his head. So again, we go back to the connection between Salome and Elizabeth. These kind of priestly families that are there. Was John part of the priesthood that went back into Jerusalem and then in his old age continued to wear priestly garments? We heard the same exact thing with James, the Lord's brother, wearing the linens of the priests, going into the temple on his knees. Same kind of thing is being told here of John.
What I like about John doing it, though, as opposed to James, is the temple's gone at this point. So, maybe there's some Protestants listening to our channel right now who are thinking, like, okay, guys, like, enough. Okay, like, the apostles aren't walking around wearing mitres, okay? Well, first, maybe the word mitre is the difficulty, but we're, the priest mitre is more of like a cloth turban, okay? So John is continuing to say, in a way, by wearing this, not drawing attention to himself, but he's drawing attention to a fact, and that is that, maybe the temple in Jerusalem is gone, but the priesthood is not gone because the temple is still here among us, the Christians. I like that. It's whether it's true or not. I don't think it's outlandish, to consider that would be the case.
Yeah.
All right. So in the next episode, what we're going to do is we're going to go through John's gospel. We're going to talk about the major themes, and then basically how it relates to the synoptic tradition of Matthew, Mark, and Luke. And then there will be a third episode after that where we talk about the first heresies. We kind of alluded to them, but in that episode, we're really going to dive into what was the first heresies that this last apostle encountered.
Yep.